Most adult viewers will remember the dramatic occasion of Watergate, a story about Richard Nixon and some of the drama around the White House. And of course, caught up in this whole situation was Charles Colson, who found himself going quickly from the chief counsel in the White House to behind bars in prison. This led to an experience out of which formed Prison Fellowship, a ministry that has been extremely effective. And of course, led to a book called Born Again, which has been made into a movie. And today we have Ron Nikkel, who's the president and CEO of Prison Fellowship International and is a Canadian. Ron, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining up today. Why a Canadian in a global ministry of Prison Fellowship?
One of those humorous accidents of God, I suppose. It was, of course, during the early 80s. The Cold War was still very much a factor affecting global politics. And when Chuck was looking at the expansion around the world that was beginning out of interest in his story, his books, and recognized that Prison Fellowship might take root in other countries, he said this has got to be led by an international, not an American. He simply wanted to avoid some of the pitfalls of something that would be American-dominated or perceived to be American-dominated.
So give us the chronology is where here?
In 1982, 83.
Okay. And describe Prison Fellowship around the world at that moment.
At that moment, it was just a bunch of people from about 5 or 6 countries where Born Again had been premiered as a film, saying, wow, that's an interesting story. Our church is engaged in prison ministry, or we have visited people in prison. How can we do what you're doing in America, or something similar to that, and become part of this? There was a real sense that God was doing something in the prison.
And then almost 30 years later, Prison Fellowship International is what?
120 countries, every region of the world, extensive ministries throughout Eastern Europe, ministries just taking root in the Middle East, very interesting stories.
Then let's go behind your role with prison. Why prison ministry for Ron Nikkel?
Well, I was working with juvenile offenders in Youth for Christ, and I sometimes say I was a failure with the juveniles, so I moved into the adult world. It was definitely the leading of the Lord. I've always had a real passion for justice, for reconciliation, and if there is ever a greater need in the world or a more strategic place to bear witness to the transforming power of God than prison, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, that just seems to me, it's a humanly impossible situation, an incredible challenge.
And then could you give us some insight then on the front lines of Prison Fellowship ministry, wherever that might be in the world, and what the encounter of a prisoner who's in such despair when they perhaps meet God, or how they meet God?
It's just a mosaic of grace, I guess is the best way of putting it. Some of them meet God because somebody cares for their kid. You know, they're incarcerated, they can't do anything to help their family who's in trouble. Now they've messed up themselves, but their family's in trouble, they can't do anything. A caring, compassionate person comes alongside and says, I'll give your kid a gift at Christmas on your behalf, or I'll visit your family, I'll provide some other kind of help. And many of the prisoners meet Christ that way.
Because it touches them so deeply.
It touches a concern that they have that they can't do anything about. They're powerless. In other countries where inmates are completely ostracized, and this would be some of the Asian countries, it's a disgrace to the family. When somebody voluntarily comes into prison and says, I love you, I care about you, it just changes dramatically changes their world, because now somebody does care. They are not untouchable. Or in many countries of Africa where up to 80% of the people in prison are there, they haven't been to trial. They haven't seen justice. They might never seen justice. They're in the most deplorable conditions you can imagine. no food, limited food, no water sometimes. Sanitation is just a disastrous creates a disastrous health situation. They're abandoned by family. They might die in prison. And somebody comes into that situation to provide food, to provide medicine, to dig a well so that they can have running water, so that they can bathe and take care of the necessities.
And that someone then, Ron, that's someone who cares enough to come into a situation like that. The workers of Prison Fellowship, what is it about them that...
It's because we recognize that Jesus was a prisoner. Jesus is there. I used to think, many of us used to think that when we went to prison, we were bringing Jesus into prison, but he's already there. So it's simply a matter of coming alongside Jesus to care about the people he cares for.
And could you identify perhaps the greatest needs of someone in prison? Top 1, 2, or 3.
Relationship.
Out of their loneliness then?
Out of their loneliness, dealing with the guilt that many of them have. Now, many of them will say, I didn't do it, I'm not guilty, I was framed, or it was unjust, or other people should be here, not me. But the bottom line is most of them feel like they're failures. They're guilty. How do they deal with that? The system doesn't help them deal with that. There's not a program that the system provides that helps them deal with that. It's the grace of God.
And in terms of Ron Nikkel, the person then, a global ministry, 120 countries, must take some kind of toll to lead. You live where? And tell us about a day or a week in the life of Ron Nikkel.
Well, it's probably the most exciting job anybody could ever imagine, also the most demanding. I travel 45% of the year. I've been to most of the countries of the world. With tremendous opportunity, but also tremendously draining challenge, because it's going into the forefront of evil with the good news of the gospel, with truth and hope and light and life, and that makes all the difference. But it is a battle. It is a battleground. And so for me, the most important thing that I can do is to stay spiritually grounded and to walk with a group of brothers who support me in every way possible. Otherwise, this would be a catastrophe.
And where do you find that support? At home or?
In my church.
Which is?
It's a little Anglican church in the U.S. in Virginia. Oh. And one of the Anglican churches that's really on fire and vibrant and very committed to outreach. And then also with a collection of friends that go back to my early days in Youth for Christ.
And then if I could give you the opportunity, I suppose, to speak with a viewer who might going, prisoners deserve it. They're where they ought to be, or where their consequences should have left them. And perhaps they don't deserve quite the attention that you're speaking of today. What challenge would you like to give the skeptic about Prison Fellowship
I would say
ministry?
We deserve it. We deserve to see justice done. And justice doesn't end at the point of punishment. Justice is done when the damage caused by crime is healed. And that's relationships, and it's the effect that crime has on the community. It's not solved by putting a person in prison, because eventually they come out. And the sad reality is that 70% of the people who are in prison today have been there before or will reoffend when they get out. Punishment alone does not work.
And what does work then?
Transformation through an encounter with Jesus Christ.
Ron, that's a strong word then about Prison Fellowship and the tremendous ministry that goes on all around the world. I'm going to say thank you to you for the vision and leadership, for creating such an effective means by which God can use people who care for prisoners and see them come to a saving, life-changing knowledge of His love. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Don, but I got to say, it's not about me. It's,
Thank you, Ron.